today I am joined by Peadar Tóibín, Aontú leader in the Dáil currently, running for the North West Midlands Region for the European elections. So why change from the Dáil to the European?
But first of all, I have to say we're delighted to be here in Donegal. We have a great team of candidates standing in the local elections. There's a really good chance that we're going to take seats in this election, which I think will be transformative in terms of politics in Donegal. The reason that I'm standing in the European elections is election campaigns themselves can be transformative. So in other words, you can change the direction of a country by actually making the case for change in an election campaign. Many people have seen the referendums just a couple of months ago. They'll see the role that we played in those referendums. We took on the political establishment and the political bubble in Leinster House, and we won. And those referendums have been a watershed moment in time. We've seen Leo Varadkar stand down. We've seen Sinn Féin, you turn in a dizzying fashion since that referendum, and all the political parties are now changing direction. So what we want to do is we want to crowbar the bread and butter issues back onto the political agenda and burst the political bubble here. We want to make sure that investment in healthcare, such as Letterkenny Hospital, is focused on in this campaign. We want to make sure that we have the Western Rail Corridor opened up in this campaign. We want to highlight that we are in a lopsided country, a city-state where all the investment is going into Dublin. We need to make sure that the political establishment know that there is an Ireland outside the M50. So the reason why we're standing in the election is to use the platform to crowbar the real issues affecting people back onto the political agenda.
A minute ago you mentioned Letterkenny University Hospital. We had protests today outside Letterkenny University Hospital. I was aware at the time you were in Killybegs eating with fishermen. But some of the statistics from here, if you haven't heard them, maybe you already have, but last year we had 5,300 people admitted to Letterkenny University Hospital across the road without access to a bed throughout the year. We were ranked the 8th most overcrowded, worst for overcrowding. We are the biggest Model 3 hospital with the least funding. What does into, not just in Europe, but locally and nationally, what is your party going to do to help solve the problems for like the paramedics who spoke with me and said that on Easter Monday they had one ambulance to cover from Inishowen to Letterkenny, which is the size of County Louth. And as the paramedic said to me, if somebody has a cardiac arrest in Mallinhead and somebody has a cardiac arrest in Burt, what do we do? I mean, we actually have ambulances from Monaghan answering calls in Donegal, and there's going to be a knock-on effect, because if that ambulance is leaving Monaghan to come to Donegal, who's covering Monaghan? So what is Aontú's commitment? A lady spoke with me, father waited 19 hours in A&E with a suspected mini stroke before he could actually be seen by a doctor. We have nearly 1,300 adults waiting on an outpatient's appointment. One endocrinologist servicing 522 type 1 diabetes patients, and he's only contracted privately for 12 hours a week. We have no neurologists. We have neurology patients here in Donegal traveling 139 kilometres to have access to a neurology appointment. So what is Aontú's promise to people who are seriously concerned about the deficits in the healthcare system here in Donegal?
Okay, so first of all, I'm the chair of the Save Navan Hospital campaign. So health is really, really important to us. We've taken tens of thousands of people onto the streets over a number of marches to protect our A&E. I also set up the National Hospital campaign about 5 years ago. We now have 18 affiliate hospital campaigns working in tandem. We held a National Day of Action, for example, very recently, where we had protests, tens of thousands of people protesting outside of those hospitals. So we have probably been doing most of all the political parties in terms of focusing on the health service. One of the biggest issues that's happening in the health service is the government are refusing to provide the proper pay, terms and conditions to doctors and nurses. And as a result, doctors and nurses are voting with their feet and they're leaving the health service in this country. Last year, 700 doctors qualified in this country, but 400 of them actually emigrated from this country, which is an incredible thing. And that's happening also with the nursing population as well. As a result, people can't get doctors and people are going into A&E. We found out, it's Aontú information, that 115,000 people in the last 5 years were sick enough or injured enough to go to an A&E, but waited for hours, never got to see a doctor, and actually left without seeing a doctor. An incredible situation. We found out that also, because the hospitals are so stuffed, the A&Es are so stuffed, that it's taken longer for the ambulances to deliver their patients. It's actually taking on average about 35 minutes for each ambulance to deliver their patients, because they just can't find room enough in the A&Es. In 2016, 1,050 people died before the ambulance actually arrived at their homes. Last year, it was 3,600 people who had died before the ambulance arrived at their homes. You made a good point in relation to ambulance. In Drogheda, we had 11 ambulances stuck outside of Drogheda Hospital for 5 hours on the one night. There was no ambulance available for Cavan, Monaghan, Louth and Meath during that whole period of time. I will say that Letterkenny is in a worse situation than many of the other hospitals. Why? Because the fact that the government will not invest in relation to the Donegal region. The government has left Donegal out on its own in many ways. And what we want to see is proper pay and conditions for all the staff that work in hospitals. Secondly, and this is different than the other political parties, we want to see accountability in terms of the hospital services. As many people at the higher echelons of the civil services are making decisions, disastrous decisions, which are costing billions of euros. There were 3.3 billion euros of compensation were paid out because of mistakes in hospitals in the last 10 years. Yet nobody has ever been held to account in relation to that. And the last point I'll say to you is, we want hospitals to be funded on the basis of the number of operations they carry out, the number of treatments, the number of consultations, and the number of engagements. Because what's happening, they're getting paid despite those issues.
Yeah.
Money's disappearing into middle management and upper management. We need that money focused on the necessary front-line staff that are there. And the very final thing I will say to you on this is workplace planning is really important. If you want a number of occupational therapists, a number of speech therapists, a number of special needs assistants, a number of any profession, you need to make sure that the correct number are going into the colleges in the first place so that they're turning out in the end. And then if you have an employment contract which is adequate for them to make a good living, they will stay in the area.
Perfect. Now, you are in Donegal today, you have been in Killybegs, you have been in Letterkenny, you've been all around Donegal, Ballybofey. Now, as we know, Donegal is the epicenter, so as far as we know, of the defective concrete block crisis. We have thousands of homes that need to be demolished and rebuilt. Now, what I want to ask you about is, firstly, the 100% redress. Do you believe the scheme is 100% redress, or do you think it needs an overhaul?
Well, first of all, we have been behind the campaign from the very start. I've spoken at protests in Dublin and elsewhere. In fairness, Mary T, I think, was one of the first people from Letterkenny to actually participate in the campaign years ago in relation to this. We believe that there should be 100% redress. This is not 100% redress. I spoke to a man in Ballybofey where you could see the defective blocks like Weetabix breaking down. It's going to cost him 70 grand extra on top of the grant that he's getting to actually be able to rebuild his house. I know of another family, it's going to cost him 100 grand extra on top of what the government are giving out. And remember, this is a mistake of the government's making, because if the government didn't provide the necessary regulations in the first place. And this is really important. This goes back to this idea of accountability. There's no accountability in this country. Fianna Fáil lowered the regulations so that their friends in the construction industry could make more profits. And as a result, people bought houses in good faith. They actually paid insurance and home bonds, and yet they're left with nothing at the end of it. We need to make sure that the people who provided those blocks are still held to account, and the politicians that allow it to happen are still held to account. If this was happening in Dublin, if this was happening in Kildare, if this was happening close to where the government is, this issue would have been resolved years ago. It's only been fixed partially because of the massive people power campaign in this area, and I want to give credit to the people involved in that.
So, continuing our conversation about the defective concrete block crisis, my main I want to say portfolio is raising awareness for disabilities, healthcare services, special education. So on the grounds of disability, when we talk about emergency accommodation, we know that there is no real emergency accommodation for people who are having to demolish their homes and rebuild. They're having to live in mobile homes. I know of one family who are actually living in 2 caravans while their house is being demolished on their land. But the question that I have put to other ministers and TDs is, if you're a person in a wheelchair, how do you live in a mobile home? Because we know the standard door size of a mobile home, and even if you get double doors into a mobile home, because we see them now, some of them where they have the double sun doors, but the hallways, the bathrooms, the bedrooms in a mobile home that we see in the caravan parks, a person with a wheelchair cannot access these mobile homes. A person with a wheelchair cannot access and live safely in a caravan. I have a family that I know of with a child in a wheelchair who will have to rebuild their home, and they have no idea where they're going to live because, as they said, even if we put the money out on a mobile home, we can live in it, but our child can't. So where are these people supposed to go? Now, I know that we have a crunch in accommodation across the country, but surely if we can bring in emergency accommodations and we can bring in modular homes for people fleeing war, which I'm not saying that I disagree with, by the way, why couldn't this be done for the families with defective concrete blocks?
Well, absolutely. First of all, I will say this, that if there was an earthquake that hit Donegal that did this damage to the housing, there would have been a massive humanitarian response by the government. But what's actually happened is that there has been a slow motion earthquake that's across Donegal, which has done this damage to the homes. Secondly, we know right now that 85% of the locations in which the government are placing asylum seekers is in the hospitality sector. A full third of all hotels currently in the state are actually being used to provide accommodation for people who come into this country. Incidentally, Donegal is one of the highest locations for IPAS and for Ukrainians to come in. And agreeing with yourself, there are some occasions where people who are fleeing war and violence need support. There's no doubt about that. But I do believe that in Donegal, logic needs to come into place here, where we actually say, we have our own humanitarian crisis happening here too. And in this humanitarian crisis, there needs to be a ring fencing of accommodation available in these localities to provide accommodation for families in Donegal to be able to live in during the rebuilding of their homes. It is absolutely wrong to expect a person with a disability to have to, go through the indignity and the physical challenge on a daily basis of being lifted in and out of a mobile home. Imagine if there was a fire, imagine if there was an emergency of any sort in that type of scenario, that people would actually be caught in there. We need to make sure that in terms of Donegal, there's a ring fencing of accommodation to make sure that people who are in a humanitarian crisis have access to accommodation.
And the final thing I would like to talk to you about, Deputy Tóibín, is immigration. Now, we've heard some people say that they like Aontú's approach to immigration, and then we've had some people from other sides of the coin say that these are anti-immigration, that these are right-wing. How would you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I'd find that kind of funny to a certain extent. But what I will say to you is this. Aontú is very much a party of compassion, but also of common sense. So back in 2019, we raised this issue first. We said there is an issue with immigration in this country. We need to have an open and respectful debate about this issue. But we also need to have common sense around it. We said it must be sustainable and it must be managed, okay? At the time, a lot of the parties, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Sinn Féin, attacked us, etc. They said that we were a threat to the cohesion of the country by even raising this. And interestingly enough, all of those same parties are now stealing our clothes. All of them are using exactly the same language that we used in this. One of our biggest problems that we have is that the government is sending out a message that there's chaos within the system. The system is not being run properly. And I'll give an example of that. So we found out that, first of all, when people come to this country, it could take 10 years for an application to be dealt with in its totality, including the appeals that might happen within the courts. And then, of the people who fail the system, because maybe they're economic migrants coming through the asylum process, of the people who fail that, we found out through Aontú questions that 85% of those people didn't have their deportation order actioned. So the law wasn't even being implemented in that regards. We also found out that 5,000 people came through Dublin Airport last year without a passport, most of those from another European country, where they had to have a passport to get on the plane. We also found out, and this is incredible, this came true there recently, that 75% of people who are registering in the southern state at the moment were coming across the border from the north of Ireland, but the government didn't even know because the minister admitted to me they weren't even asking the question. Now, all we're saying is you can't manage if you're not measuring, if you're not even asking the question. So what we need to do is send out a message to the world that yes, we have compassion. Where there's a need in very difficult circumstances, we will do our best as long as it's sustainable. But we also need to say that we will differentiate between those who don't need help as well, and those people who are not really asylum seekers won't be given accommodation in this country, because obviously we're at a sustainability difficulty at the moment. So this has been our policy for a long period of time. we have the difference between ourselves, I suppose, and the other political parties is we have a backbone to be able to stand up for what we believe in. There is a political bubble where a lot of the politicians are just simply talking to themselves and to NGOs. Aontú is radically different in that we will analyse the evidence ourselves, we'll make a decent decision, and because of our, I suppose, backbone, we'll be able to stand up for what we believe in. And that's what's missing in our country at the moment.